And
Okay.
so today I have Nikolai Blinow, and she is a therapist and a coach, and we focus on a very similar population. We both work with
Mhm.
high performers, entrepreneurs, business owners,
Mhm.
leaders. But she also specializes in ADHD, burnout, balance, regulation, and primarily wanted to have her on for that ADHD component. And she practices as a licensed therapist, where I do not. I practice primarily as a coach with that therapeutic background. So, first
Mhm.
of all, is that accurate? Is that how you would describe who you work with?
That is so accurate. We will get to this later. I am an ADHD person myself, and some of my biggest struggle is I want to do all the things and help all of the people. And so here it is reflected in my niche: leaders, executives, entrepreneurs with burnout, balance. Maybe one day I'll niche down further, but for now, I just want to help the people who need the helping.
I mean, that's a pretty good niche. Like I've niched down to sort of the similar thing. I think we've talked about this. And for us, as also an ADHD person, as someone who wants to help other people, that's pretty good. I would say before that, I was like, anyone that comes in my door. So I think we've done a good job given our circumstances. That's
It's
what I would say.
only taken me, I've been in practice, I think, since 2014. So 11 years, but there were definitely years of me just, again, as you sound like you've done as well. I want to help all the people. But what I've learned, and I guess this is even good business advice for potential people listening, uh, sometimes wanting to help all of the people actually makes it harder for your perfect people to find you, because when you're too general, it can overwhelm people and not let them know what direction they should point themselves in.
Yeah, well, and we'll probably pivot into business too, because we
Mhm.
just have so much of that. I say with marketing, when I'm teaching people, and I had to learn it myself, when you speak to everyone, you actually speak to no one. So you have to speak to someone specifically. And then
Mhm.
what happens is someone comes in that maybe doesn't fit that mold. Like primarily work with people who have leadership issues, but a business owner who doesn't have people yet and doesn't plan on hiring might come in the door, and then,
Mhm.
they see that marketing and they're like, oh no, I'm not a leader yet. And I'm like, well, first of all, everyone's a leader. You lead yourself every day. Like, the same principles apply. That's just my marketing girl. Like, come on in. So
Mhm.
you kind of hinted at it, but tell me a little bit more about why this population.
I, my gosh, I'm so happy to say I fell into working with this population of people and to try and abbreviate it as much as possible. Fun fact, Lauren and I went to the same undergraduate school. I worked in marketing and institutional advancement, which is basically big fancy fundraising with big fancy donors. Because I shared this before we started recording. My dad's an immigrant, came over from Eastern Europe. So uh, hard work was instilled in me. And I really wanted a career where I basically had a stable income and predictability. But I also really wanted to do work that I was passionate about. And so I felt doing development and marketing work, but for institutes of higher education, would be a nice way to blend. I'm going to be a nice, stable business lady with helping support an institute of higher education, which is something that I just really am grateful for and place value on. And I did that. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I am so susceptible to burning myself out, because even when I was a tiny baby 22-year-old, newly out of college, out into the world, I've always been the person in every role that I've been in where it has been easy to give me more responsibility. And been able to sort of climb through the ranks pretty easily. And people recognized in me early on an ability to make high value decisions. And one of my supervisors used to say, you have the ability to see the world from what you'd call 30,000 feet, which means like I could see the big picture, which was really good for broader decision making and planning. And where that becomes relevant to doing my work is I basically learned that if I continued on my corporate trajectory, I would keep climbing probably, but I also really value my time and my flexibility and my freedom. And for better or for worse, I had a temp job in college where I would often finish my work around lunchtime and they would just send me home and pay me for the full day. And
Nice.
that was the best, but I think it ruined me because it showed me the value of my free time. And then I realized in corporate that that's not an impossible sell, but it's a harder sell to make that, hey, you should just let me do my job and then go home when I'm done with it. So I reflected on what were my favorite parts of my job. And I really loved working with donors and alumni, getting to know them as part of my development work. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if basically I could solicit people, which is what you do when you work in professional fundraising and marketing, trying to market to them to make big donations? What if I could solicit people on themselves and then I sell them on their own goals? That would be freaking awesome. And then I get to leverage all of my people skills and the things I love about my work with more autonomy than I would have gotten if I had continued up that corporate trajectory. So I made a switch. I became a therapist. Shocker, this is what happens when you're a therapist. You end up eventually attracting similar people. So pretty early on, I was doing a lot of career work and a lot of burnout work. And the longer that I did that, the more I started diagnosing people with undiagnosed ADHD and referring them out for confirmation of the diagnosis. And then I realized, oh my God, I think I'm onto something here. There are a group of people out there who are neurodivergent, who have ADHD, who are super high performing, who are flying under the radar because if you look at us on paper, we look like we are crushing it. And we're
Mhm.
very driven and we're very successful. And if you give us a goal, we'll achieve it. But what we might not see, because people aren't always talking about it, is in the background, we might be burning ourselves out, struggling with things like just feeling chronically fatigued, maybe a little unfulfilled, because we just don't know how to regulate our energies most effectively. So that's my long tangent that I tried to make brief, but I think it's all helpful to know.
Well, I think especially that ending there is like really that's where we want to get into it, right? Like you're talking about this undiagnosed ADHD that you've been seeing in essentially what you're calling these high performers. They're people that on paper had it figured out. Why do you think it's gone? These people have made it into their adult lives undiagnosed.
I think there's a few reasons. One is, gosh, I was born in the 80s, so grew up in the 80s/90s. I definitely remember being in classrooms with kids that I would probably point to those kids and go, those are the ADHD kids. We had a very particular understanding. So, depending on the age, I say if you're in your late 40s, 50s, you're of a generation ADHD may not have even been thought of as a diagnosis at all. If you're a little bit younger, you're in your 40s, 30s, we knew about ADHD, but we thought of it in a very particular way, which we thought of ADHD as the disruptive kids, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people who got captured where I think what we would consider stereotypical ADHD. So ADHD, for people who don't know officially, stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we used to think that meant attention deficit, you can't focus. So these are the kids who are constantly distracting other kids in the classroom, or hyper. They're literally like, there was a kid in my school in fifth grade who used to imagine that he was riding a dirt bike down the hallway. That kid definitely has a more stereotypical form of ADHD. I would bet
Okay.
money on it. Um, but there's a lot of us who don't fit what they thought the traditional ADHD mold was. And the other reason I think is some of us, because of our personal backgrounds, because of our personalities, those of us who are high performers a lot of the ADHD symptoms that we have, I think we actually channeled into our work. For example, I loved school. I love learning. Still to this day, it's a value that I hold personally. I'm always trying to learn and grow as a person. If you put me in a classroom, okay, I'm the dream student in some ways. I literally, in third grade, have a memory of getting in trouble, air quotes, because a student teacher said, "Can you please stop raising your hands because other kids need to have an opportunity to answer the question?" But I was so like, I know the answer to everything.
Right. Okay.
Um, that's not what we think of as ADHD. That's what we think of as either an overachiever or gifted. I was actually assessed for gifted classes, and that's not what we thought. And then I think the third thing too, just to add another footnote, women especially. There's a lot of talk in the ADHD community that, quite frankly, the diagnostic criteria is gendered because it's historically been studied in men and boys. And so the average age of ADHD diagnosis right now in women is 38 because
Wow.
so many women have not been captured because the criteria maybe it just
Yeah.
misses them.
And that makes sense because I think about a lot of different studies and like, predominantly it's changed a little bit, but even when I was in undergraduate school reading research and it was limited by the fact that where do most research studies happen? On college campuses. And so it's usually the population of the college students, which dismisses that's not a representative sample, right? So when you think
Mm-hmm.
about this, like I think about my own life and getting diagnosed later.
Mm-hmm.
And for those listening, I also want to point out we are going to talk about the overdiagnosis. I want to bring that up and like,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. But for me, when I look back, tell me if this is what you're talking about here. Like, so that hyperactivity could also look like hyper focus on things that you really, really are passionate about, right? So with
Mm-hmm.
you, I love learning now that I'm an adult, but I didn't always, but I loved learning certain subjects. So I look
Mm-hmm.
back to what my attention deficit looked like. And again, we did good enough to get by. I didn't enjoy history. I still
Mm-hmm.
like I want to learn about it. It's not that I don't see the value. I just can't help that it's not my passion. And I would read an entire page and my mind wandered the whole time. I would read the words in my mind. And I remember in like seventh or eighth grade, I had a conversation with my history teacher. Like, I'm not sure why I can't do well in this class. I have A's everywhere else and I have like a B, I'm bordering a C. And if you get C's, you're in trouble in my house. And, you know, she's like, well, you have to do the reading, Lauren. And I was like, I don't know how to explain that I'm reading the words, but I'm not remembering anything. I read the whole page, and it was such a struggle for me, but I was able to do good enough to get by. And so
Mm-hmm.
those things, so things like that. And then also I used to think my family joked I had OCD. And in retrospect, now with the diagnosis, so tell me like what your thoughts are on all of these kinds of things, because maybe someone out there resonates on this side versus, the other sides. So it was I realize now I'm obsessed with organization, which people used to call
Mm-hmm.
OCD, but it's because when things are out of place, I will miss them, forget them. But if they're in a place, it helps my ADHD. So I was actually, what I did was I figured out a way to manage those ADHD symptoms without
Mm-hmm.
realizing it. I was a problem solver. So is that
Mm-hmm.
sort of how it might have showed up in other people, or what, like, how did it show up early on for people?
Yeah, 100%. I think the experience you share is pretty textbook for a lot of high performing ADHD people. I did well in school because, full disclosure, another podcast, I had a lot of early childhood trauma where home was a mess, but school was like talking about the OCD thing. I had
Control what you can
control over
control.
variables. Yeah. And I loved when teachers loved me and I got the gold star. I think I was a little kid, so I wasn't consciously thinking of that. But I think school became an outlet for me where I could perform well. I could have some comfort in knowing like I could do this, I could get an A. It was predictable. My teachers loved me. Like I got a lot of needs met at school that I wasn't getting met in my crazy, chaotic household, which again, we can talk about some other time if you want to do another podcast on that. Um, so that's why I think for me, I never had that experience of excelling over here, but like not so much over there because my school was very much feeding a need for me. But I know so many of my ADHD clients or just peers. My husband is ADHD as well, and he would tell you that is textbook his experience. And that's what, when we think about attention deficit, I think that's exactly what we're talking about with stereotypes that are not accurate. We think attention deficit means you don't have the willpower and you're not putting the work in. But really, what we know now about ADHD is the attention deficit is actually a deficit in working memory
Mm.
and a deficit in your ability to internalize things that basically don't give you enough of a dopamine hit. So
And
if you
for
like
those listening,
science,
yeah.
go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say because I just actually recently posted about this about like people like who have like there's long to-do lists that take too long, whatever, and they're overwhelmed by it. Like that's actually people think working memory is just about memory, but it's actually about problem solving and cognitive load. And so just to
Mhm.
clarify, it's not just about like I don't remember this, but it's about I used to like throw a fit at my siblings when they were being loud and I was trying to do homework at the kitchen table because if it was math, I was good. I could go through anything, no distractions. But if I hear the littlest thing when I'm trying to read something, I'd lose it because I couldn't comprehend, I couldn't focus. So
Mhm.
working memory for those listening, just to be aware, is not just about your short-term memory, right? It's about literally how I process information live.
Yeah, it's literally about what are you sort of remembering and internalizing in real time. Your working memory is basically your short-term memory, and that's what you're in when you're trying to study or when you're trying to put deep work in.
Mhm.
And if we know that ADHD working memory is just different, it means that literally the way that you engage with tasks is different, the way you learn is different. The cognitive load, like you said, that you
Mhm.
experience is genuinely different.
Yeah, and I even think about like I was an athlete, and I athlete was the area I excelled. I did good enough in school, but I was an
Mhm.
athlete. And I think back, and what I see now is, exercise helps ADHD symptoms, and I was always moving. I'm a kinesthetic learner, which a lot of ADHD people I think are. And so, of course, I did well because I could feel it and then do it, and that's athletics. And so, would you say that? A lot of high performers find themselves like in athletics or a lot of ADHD people found themselves in athletics or, I guess where does that come into play?
I think it's a fair hypothesis. I anecdotally can say doing this for 11 years and working with hundreds, maybe thousands of people by now, um, most ADHD people that I see are kinesthetic learners, which means we learn by doing. We're very body-based people. And then the secondary learning style is visual learners. Then there's the third learning style, which is auditory, which means you learn through just hearing information. Um, so I think that's why sometimes those challenges in school show up. I
Mhm.
think that's why probably a lot of ADHD people are drawn to athletics because they have
Mhm.
that kinesthetic learning style where you just feel good when you're in your body.
Mhm.
And also, even as a therapist, I think one reason why traditional therapy has sometimes failed ADHD people is if you think about therapy, you're sitting in front of someone and you're talking to them, right? We're asking you to use your auditory processing and learning style, which is actually your weakest point when you're an ADHD person. So, as a therapist who's also a coach, I am always thinking about when I'm trying to help people actually change their behaviors, how can we appeal to their kinesthetic and their visual learning style and actually make sure, like, when we're in therapy or coaching, I'm having them like do the thing that I'm trying to coach them through so that I can see them actually go through the process and their body is internalizing it and we're working through things together. Or I'm always giving people worksheets or I'm having them pull up worksheets in session and telling them, look at this worksheet while I'm telling you this. Because if you look at it and I'm telling you, Lauren, here's what I want you to do, and here's why, now you're actually going to understand and your brain is going to follow through on it versus if I just said, Lauren, you are task switching too much. And so what I need you to do is try this thing called time chunking. And here's why it's going to work. And if I just say that to you, I could guarantee you 90% of the time the client will come back and like not do the thing that I
Yep.
suggested because we're not working with people's actual brain processing styles. You need to have a therapist and a coach who understands the sort of neurological functioning in your brain to get you the biggest impact.
Yeah. What would you just real quickly, how would you define the difference between therapy and coaching? And do you sort of also follow up, do both with everybody, or do you have clients that are one or the other?
I would say the more cliche understanding of therapy is people come to therapy when they have problems. Usually, when people come to therapy, shit's hit the fan in some way. And we're focused on healing,
Mhm.
right? So often the cliche of therapy is there's some trauma that needs healing, or there's some sort of medical mental health diagnosis, like you have anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, PTSD, or something like that. ADHD is also technically a diagnosable condition, so you can get therapy for ADHD. But therapy, I think of as more a medical model sort of approach where the goal is to make you just not feel sick.
Hmm.
I use the analogy sometimes of diabetes, right? There's obviously type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and some diabetes people are just born with, and some are lifestyle diseases that evolve over time,
Yep.
right? You can go to a doctor if you have type 2 diabetes, which is lifestyle related diabetes. You can go to a doctor, they can medicate you with insulin, and they can hopefully regulate your blood sugar so that you're less likely to have a diabetic attack, right? There are also those who believe that if you make significant lifestyle changes, you might be able to get your A1C down and regulate your blood sugar, and potentially, in certain cases, even not be insulin dependent.
Yep.
That type of doctor who's going to treat you that way is probably going to be more of like a naturopathic or holistic physician because their focus is on resolving the root cause and optimizing your functioning versus a traditional doctor is diagnosing you with diabetes and making sure your diabetes basically doesn't kill you or make you even sicker.
Yep.
Therapy historically is a medical model, so we can diagnose, and the benefit there is if people pay me and I can diagnose them, I can give them a super bill and they can submit that to their insurance, and their
Yep.
insurance might reimburse them for a portion of their cost. Or they could use their flex spending account or the health
Yep.
savings account, which is something that is available to people with me because I'm a medical professional who can diagnose you. With that said, with coaching, it's more focused on what do you need right now? How are we going to help you be the best self in your future? We actually don't care about diagnoses, but we can give them to you if that's important to you, or it's going to help you
Hmm.
leverage benefits that you have. Because our goal isn't just to not make you sick.
Hmm.
Our goal is to make you the most fulfilled, happiest version of yourself. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, the current medical system isn't necessarily set up. So when you go to a therapist, and I've seen this, plenty of people who go to therapy and they plateau or they only get so far because a lot of therapists aren't even trained in that coaching to take
Hmm.
you beyond like, well, now that you're not completely fucking miserable and you're not having a breakdown every day, like you're good, air quotes
Yeah.
good,
Yep.
but like maybe you're not, maybe you're just not bad.
Yeah, and you still have some of those ingrained patterns, and it's now how do we make it so that these things or whatever you go through in the future, like you said, optimize, we can prevent you from getting so far back again, or recognizing your
Mm-hmm.
triggers, or understanding why your thought patterns are non-productive, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I say the same thing as I basically say, there's a lot the reason that I don't practice as a licensed therapist, and you've found a really cool way to blend the two, and I've yet to find someone who's done that. And so I kind of was like, I don't want to be held back by those traditional medical models. I don't believe in diagnosing just for the sake of billing their insurance, right? And so and not that I see it now how like I could have benefited from it to some degree, right? But I like that idea of like they can't self-disclose, right? There, you have to be really aware of why you're disclosing things like that. And I find that the people I work with, these high performers, I still use that therapeutic knowledge of why am I disclosing? Is this to help them? Is it, it's not to help me? Is it to relate, to show them? And a lot of them do really well because they're used to coaches who share from their experiences. And so I've found that that blend, and I've had people come to me who were in traditional therapy, and because in traditional therapy, you ask, and they have to get there. And sure, sometimes you're wrong, so you don't want to do too much leading, but sometimes you can see it and they'll get there faster if you just point out, hey, does this resonate? And so my clients will, and they'll tell me, no, that doesn't. Okay, great, let's keep pivoting and figure it out. But when it does, I could have spent 3 sessions trying to get there. And instead I was able to point it out, they resonate. Now they have that understanding of like, they like to understand framework. They like to understand, okay, this makes sense. Now I understand why this happens. Now let's solve it, right? And so I like that blend of like being able to point things out while also still asking and making sure that it resonates and letting them come to their own conclusions. So that's kind of how I say I blend the two is I'm like, I'm still figuring out therapy is my therapeutic orientation, right? Is where do people's problems come from? How do they develop? So I use those psychology things to figure out where I think your problems might be coming from and see what resonates with you. But then we also problem solve and we go to optimization and we go to great. People will come and be like, man, I scheduled a session, but nothing's going wrong. I'm like, great, this is the perfect time to have a session. Like, let's keep talking.
Yeah, and I know I shared this analogy with you when you and I chatted one-on-one, and I think we should share it for your listeners. You're an athlete. I'm not an athlete, and sports a little bit, but I live in America, so I've watched football before. I actually really like basketball. When you watch a sporting event, like if you think of football or basketball, often before the game, you'll see physical therapists out with the athletes, and they'll be doing stretches and getting them ready, right, to play the game. That's sometimes what I think of as a therapist. We're mental health therapists. Our goal is to make sure you're healthy enough to quote unquote play the game being your life or your business, right? Because if you're not healthy, right, an athlete with a torn ACL cannot go in and play, right? So step one is you have to be physically and mentally healthy, right? A coach is the person with the expertise and the awareness and the skill set to step back, watch what's happening in the game, make the game plans, give the instruction, think about what players should be in when. Because in theory, I could get a person really healthy and I could put them out on the football field. But if they're running in the opposite direction, right, and they're running towards the other team's end zone, we're going to have a problem. And it doesn't matter how healthy they are. They also need the coach to give the direction.
Yes.
And I think there are times, like I have clients that I work with who I also have in therapy with someone who's not me, because there's some very specific healing work that I think it's just going to benefit from having their own version of a physical therapist for their brain and then me
Yep.
to function as a coach. But then I also think I have a lot of people who they just really want both. And
Yep.
it's, we need to heal what needs healing so you're healthy enough to play the game of life. But then it's not very effective or efficient for us to just stop and throw you into the game of life without guidance and instruction.
Yeah, I love that. I remember when we talked about that, and especially with like a lot of my clients are in the healthcare professions, but they've pivoted too to get away from the insurance models or what have you, and they kind of do the same thing. They're talking about optimization versus just like getting you ready to play and how do we, okay, now that you're ready, how do we make it so you build the strength so you don't get re-injured, things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
that's I think what we're doing here, but on that coaching side. So I love that analogy. To kind of bring it back to sort of the ADHD stuff, and I want to dive a little bit more into what it shows up and looks like, and then I want to pivot to sort of like your thoughts on how society contributes and overdiagnosis and things like that. But so high performers, people that are experiencing burnout, things like, is anyone who's experiencing burnout at a high performer, would you say probably has ADHD, or would you say that there's certain criteria you look for?
Yeah, there's certain criteria. So I just did a podcast interview with a woman who's actually a physician coach, and she does a lot of institutional burnout work where she works with individuals on a coaching level, but she also works with healthcare systems to help prevent burnout free healthcare systems because the
Wow,
healthcare
that's needed.
industry, yeah, wicked. One industry where burnout is really running rampant. And I know she would say, her name's Tanya. I believe, depending on the data you look at, it's like 40 to 80% of your vulnerability to burnout is actually attributable to the system. So the system you're in actually really, really contributes to the likelihood that you will burn out. And so there are a lot of people who are burnt out in the world who don't have ADHD. They're just living in broken systems.
I
And
love that.
I
And would
would,
you say even personally, like, because I help a lot of people with their personal systems. I'm like, your issue is that you don't have a personal system. So like their own systems, if they just had tools and strategies, they could overcome some of this burnout.
yeah, and I was literally just going to say, I would argue that even American culture around
Yes.
work and productivity is
Yes.
maybe a system that we're existing in that is contributing to burnout and this idea of feeling like we should be on all the time. We should always be doing something. It's very output and outcome focused. That's a system I think that permeates all the other kinds of systems they're in, whether it's our job system, our family system. So you're much more likely to burn out if you're in a system that's going to burn you out. And that doesn't matter if you have ADHD or not, right? And most of the contributing factors to you burning out are going to be the system that you're in. With that said, right, I shared I first started burning out in my early 20s. I was in an Ivy League institution. So I was in higher
Mm.
education, but a very elite institution. So the demands of that institution were especially high compared to some other institutes of higher education. So I had those systemic factors, I think, that would leave me more vulnerable to burning out. With that said, I thought, oh, I'll just become a therapist, work for myself, have clients that I love, make my own hours, and I'll never burn out again. And I'll say, I don't think I clinically burnt out to the degree, but like magically, oh my gosh, shocker, it didn't fix everything because there's still that, depending on how we're crunching the numbers, the 20 to 60% or whatever, that's attributable to us.
Hmm.
Right. And it doesn't matter if we're in a perfect system, there are still factors within us that also leave us vulnerable to burnout. And I would argue that ADHD is a vulnerability factor that leaves you more
Mm.
likely to burn out. And so if you have ADHD, I think you're more likely to burn out no matter what. But then if you have ADHD and you're also in a system that isn't working, then statistically that likelihood of you burning out is even higher because now you have your internal variable plus your external variable. So
Yeah,
you're not in a
that's a
great
great way to put
place.
it. That's a great way to
Mm-hmm.
put it. And I think will resonate with a lot of people. So what about like I say that, some ADHD symptoms, the typical ones that people think of are like the distraction, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
make all of my clients turn off notifications on their phones, turn off their
Mm-hmm.
watch notifications, and they'll come to me and go, this, like in 2 days, they're like, I saw a significant change in my just stress level, all this stuff. So, how much is it that someone might be vulnerable to ADHD from a genetic or experiential standpoint, like it's in their DNA, versus uh, society and the things that are around us today and technology is causing ADHD symptoms. And so everyone's kind of like, I have ADHD, which is it, or is it some combination?
Yeah, so I will say if you have ADHD, it is genetic. And so if you want to tease out, is it just modern society or is it ADHD? Some things to think about that will help you tease it out are, is literally anyone in my family diagnosed with ADHD? A lot of women in their 30s, like I shared, are getting diagnosed because maybe they're having children who are getting diagnosed,
Mm,
right? So, and ADHD and autism also have a lot of correlation. So even if you don't have someone in your family with ADHD, but you have someone with autism or high functioning autism, which used to be known of as Asperger's, then there is a higher likelihood that you may have ADHD. And if it's ADHD, if we think about it enough, usually you'll start to look back and you'll find indicators.
yep.
So, for example, for me, I flew under the radar because I was always high performing. But I used to torture my mother. I have memories of being probably 5 years old, and I would only wear ankle socks. And I grew up in the 80s when slouchy crew socks were popular. And my mom would buy them for me, and I hated them
That was a
because all I could focus
sensory
on
thing.
was like, yes, I hated the
Yes.
slouchiness of it.
I had a
That is
sock
such
thing
an
too. Mine had
ADHD
to be the
thing.
seams over the toes instead of like around the front of the toes. And I was a figure skater, and my mom had to get my tights that way. And it was like a pain in the butt, but it was like I cannot function if I don't have this. This is a real
Exactly.
thing.
Because the hyper focus, right? The attention deficit
Yes.
goes to like, I'm so focused on this thing that now that's like all I can focus on. So usually when people do a little bit of digging into their past, they might not find what we call traditional signs of ADHD, like bad grades, running late, behavioral issues, but they'll find things like that that go, oh yeah, I can't tell you, Lauren, we should call it the sock hypothesis because that is a thing. Whenever I mention that to people, so many of my ADHD people go, stop.
I have a
Oh my
sock
God,
story.
me too. It was the socks. Or sometimes sleeves, like people don't like things being too tight under their armpits.
Yeah, yeah.
There's something, there's usually something. Now, I will put a footnote on that because working memory is a thing for ADHD. ADHD people, unfortunately, like me, are also more likely to have childhood trauma, and they believe that's because ADHD runs in families. So you might have an ADHD parent who didn't know it, and that causes them to be emotionally dysregulated, which then creates trauma in you, which then gets passed
Yeah.
down. But why that's important is if your working memory already isn't good, and you potentially have trauma, which also impacts memory. Some people with ADHD have trouble like actually remembering their childhood, and it's not necessarily super traumatic or bad. It's just because their brain hasn't stored a lot of memory information because of the nature of ADHD
Yeah.
brains
There's a
in memory.
difference. I say this like I went through a lot of trauma in high school. And
Mm-hmm.
prior to that, I have a decent memory. Like there are things I remember vividly. I couldn't, people will be like, remember that great catch you made in this game? And it'll be like it'll be, a month later. And I'm like, no, I don't remember that game. Like this was back then and
Mm-hmm.
now. And so that time was a trauma response, right? Like my
Mm-hmm.
body was functioning to do anything else to survive. That memory was less
Mm-hmm.
important. Versus
Mm-hmm.
some of the stuff I don't remember from childhood is probably more that ADHD working memory issues, right? And I think a lot of people, associate, oh, memory loss with trauma, and they forget. And also, not to mention that the research shows our memories are trash anyway, and we all like, because we're designed to, connect stories and make things up, and and we will believe it. But I do
Mm-hmm.
agree that that's how people will be like, yeah, yeah, trauma, so I forget this, and but there's also that like, well, what if this was a case too? So that's really interesting. Would you say that when you think back to like I think about my people today and what that might show up like. What does ADHD show up like besides burnout and the emotional regulation piece? So this is,
Mm-hmm.
I think, the piece that this is my. Tell me if this makes sense or what you'd correct or add onto this.
Mm-hmm.
That it might not be that you can't regulate your behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you might have learned the self-control to regulate your behaviors around the emotion. So you're not the person who
Mm-hmm.
throws a chair or acts out. But that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean you've actually learned to regulate your emotions. And so you're still feeling it extremely strongly. And maybe it's coming out in a different behavior, like the way that you phrase something or talk to someone,
Mm-hmm.
or it's just all bottled up in you. So emotional regulation is different from behavior regulation. And so just because you regulate your behaviors does not mean you actually regulate your emotions. And some of these people, maybe that's where it's showing up and they're overthinking and in their own head or whatever those things may be. Like, is that how maybe you see it show up in some of your high performing individuals?
Yeah, I think if anything, my high performing people tend to be great at behaviorally regulating. They're good at that, right? And that emotional regulation piece, they tend to more internalize it and turn it inward. Um, so here's a fun little brain science fact about ADHD brains. We have this structure in our brain called the cerebellum, which is the part of our brain that's really responsible for proprioception, which is basically finding our body in space and movement and balance. And there's basically two halves. They find in ADHD brains that basically the little strip in between the two halves that connects the two parts of the cerebellum is slightly smaller in ADHD brains. But what I find interesting is they're learning the more they study the cerebellum, it's not just responsible for physical balance, they're also finding it's just responsible for emotional balance.
Wow. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. And so a lot of ADHD people, however, I am one of these people. You probably not because you're an athlete. Like I perpetually will drink coffee and miss my mouth and spill it on
I do actually
myself.
do that. I do that. You would think you were talking about this, and all I could think about was the fact that I am an athlete, but I'm also a klutz, and I have random bruises all over my body because I bump into stuff all the time. And people are like, "What's that from?" I look like I'm abused, and I'm like, I don't even know what to tell you. I don't know what
I
I
don't
bumped
even
into.
remember where it came from.
Yes.
Yes. And I think that's literally evidence of like that little difference in the cerebellum where our balance is just like a little bit off. And so we might not see it in really obvious ways, but we're perpetual coffee
Oh,
spillers, we're
yeah.
perpetual bump into table people. But that also is being associated with emotional balance. And so I think a lot of people, I tell this story. My husband's an electrician. And so I know how to do some basic electrical stuff. Like I can put in an outlet,
Good for
which
you.
is pretty cool. Yeah.
I would
And
I would electrocute myself, so I'm proud of you.
but we offered to help one of my dear friends. She still had all her outlets. Her house was built in 1986 and she had all the original outlets. And we offered to help. And my husband said, okay, you're going to do the outlets and I'll do the light switches because if we're going to do this nice thing, it's a team effort. Oh my gosh, by the end, I was like cursing at these outlets because I know how to do it, but I hate the like detail work. You really have to like get in there with an outlet. And once you're like
Mm.
in the electrical wiring, you learn that some people wire houses better than others. Um, and it's fine, right? I don't go around in my professional life cussing at people and yelling at things and throwing things. But when I'm in my safe spot and I'm working on these electrical outlets with my friends, I am saying, I fucking hate this so much. Why the fuck did we agree to do this? I need this to be
Yep.
over. I hate who built this house. I think I want to burn this house to the ground.
Nikolai, you just became the most relatable human being I think I've ever met. So, yes, that's such a good point. So, when you think about that, it's like it shows up in different ways and you might be able to control it and you've managed certain things. So, you're really talking
Mhm.
about that like emotional thing and which is also probably why it's overlooked is like, oh, at work they're doing all the things right, and
Mhm.
but then it's at home or whatever. And so they might have home problems versus, but I guess let's kind of dive into that medication too. So, we're kind of
Mhm.
seeing how it might show up in everyday life,
Mhm.
which is so much more
Mhm.
relatable. And also, thank you. So I cannot wait for my family. I'm gonna make them listen to this and be like, this is why I bump into
Okay.
everything, but I'm also super athletic. Like I can't tell you why, but now I at least know why. The
Mhm.
one part, why I'm athletic,
Mhm.
well, who knows?
Mhm.
So medication. What are your views on
Yes.
medication when it comes to managing ADHD? Like when should it come into play? Should it come into play? Should it not? Especially I have, a lot of my population is very like anti-medication and anti-surgery and things like
Mhm.
that. And
Mhm.
it took me a long time to understand
Mhm.
the benefits of medication in all kinds, like, I mean, not just ADHD, but so just, I guess, where's your stance
Mhm.
in philosophy on that? And then let's tie it to ADHD.
Totally. So I will say, literally sitting right next to me, I have this book, Nutritional and Integrative Treatments for Mental Health Disorders. I've done training on nutritional and holistic interventions on mental health with naturopathic physicians who specialize in mental health. I see a naturopathic physician myself, in addition to a primary care physician. And I did a TED talk on yoga and its connection to mental health.
And
So
we will
I'm
link
a
that here too.
holistic person. Yeah, link it. Why not? But so I am a holistic person into my bones. Now, with that said, I will also share the longer I've been working in the ADHD world, the more amenable I have become to medication. And I actually am on ADHD medication myself because at age 40, I decided fuck it. I kind of want to try it. Especially as a woman in her 40s now. Sometimes there are fun hormonal changes that start to happen with like
Yes.
perimenopause. And also that lining up with a phase of life where in our late 30s, early to mid 40s, we're at probably our most demanding points of our lives and our careers.
Hmm.
I decided to try it, but also what I can share and what I share with my clients is if you read the ADHD research and you study in those communities, the data will show over and over again that honestly, ADHD brains respond really, really, really well to medication.
Hmm.
My AirPod fell out. Hold on.
I saw something fall, but yeah, that's
I
interesting.
got these yesterday, people. Lauren heard this, so they're brand new. Yeah,
Oh.
and I don't think my ears are used to them. Um, So, with certain mental health disorders, the data may not be quite as promising on how likely medication is to help you, but ADHD brains respond really well to medication. Quite frankly, the most effective form of medication for ADHD brains has been shown to be stimulant medication, which I think sometimes there's some stigma around it and it freaks people out. And we can talk about that if you want. Um, but the data is just there and I've seen it. And I'm going to share a fun anecdotal story.
Yeah.
Uh, my husband also has ADHD and also decided to try medication within the past year. He's very successful. He's in a position of leadership at his company. He's an electrician, but he works for a large corporate professional, more like industrial commercial size electrical company. And he's in a leadership position. Um, he's one of those people, has worked his way up. He literally dropped out of community college because he wasn't into it or it didn't hold his interest enough. And now he's in a leadership position. So on paper, looks really good. Eh, he kind of has a shopping Amazon addiction, air quotes, where in our group, everyone will joke every time you come to our house, there'd be a package because my husband would order something. One day, my husband and I were looking at our credit card statements, and my husband said, "Oh, babe, I haven't bought anything online for like a long time, probably 3 or 4 weeks, maybe longer. I just haven't bought anything." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Uh, didn't you start taking ADHD medication? I wonder when that would be." And he looked back and he went, "Oh my God. Literally, I started taking medication. I stopped online shopping."
And that's one thing we didn't dive into too much on the impulsivity and that
Mhm.
behavior and how it doesn't always have to be, and people associate it with like negative behaviors. Like, oh, they're impulsive, they act out. It's like it could be impulsively shopping. It could be, I have that too, but it'll be like what I've done now is I put it in my cart if it's something that I need, like an everyday thing that I'm like, okay, I need this within 2 days. I'm out of deodorant. And do I have time to stop at the store? And if in those 2 days I haven't had time to stop at the store, I go, okay, Amazon's going to deliver it to me because that's more of a, I'm going to forget every time I drive. If I don't drive by the store, I forget to go to the store. So it's like,
Mhm.
it's in some ways it can be an asset, but there's different impulses we might have. I have an impulse to like text immediately something that I'm thinking, and then I'm like, that was unnecessary. I didn't need to text that. Like, not even negative stuff. It's just like, I could have waited to call, but I was afraid I was going to forget. Or,
Mhm.
interrupting is a common one for
Mhm.
ADHD, right? So that impulsivity and then the medication helped it. I love that. It must be so fun for him to date a therapist. I know dating me is so fun when people are like, okay, I'm not your client right now. And I'm like, well,
Mhm.
but I can help you.
But I have so many things that I see that I can share with you.
Like, people pay me for this and you
Mhm.
have it for free
Get
and
it
you
for
don't want to take
free.
it. Exactly.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I love that story. So and I'll share too, like, I want to talk about the stigma for a minute, and I'll share my own personal. I actually, so for years I've had the same therapist for 15 years. She cannot retire. She's the best, and us therapists need like the highest tier therapist because we can, I'm like, I know when you're using silence and I'm done talking, so keep going. Like, I
Mhm.
know her tricks. And I worked with her for years and years and years. And after a long time, I had sat in her chair the first day and said, I don't believe in medication. Don't put me on meds. Like, I just
Mhm.
want to 8 years later, I sat in her chair and I said, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on me on medication. And so she was like, and she phrased it after a long conversation where she shared her beliefs and that she's not first to medicate, but she said, I just think you've tried all the cognitive behavioral therapies in
Mhm.
the world, and life doesn't have to be this hard.
Mhm.
And that's what my turning point was, to try, a Prozac for the anxiety, depression stuff, right? And I still, so then I tried whatever. I'm on such a low dose. Most people are on like 100 plus milligrams of Prozac for context people. They work you up to, I'm on 20 milligrams. It's what I say is just enough to take the edge off. And then, yes, I
Mhm.
also recently started ADHD medication. And I call it my cocktail, and it took me a long time to figure out. And all it does was it to me, it's I just said, is this how normal people feel?
Mhm.
That's what I said. I go, is this how everybody else has felt their whole life? Like the ability to
Mhm.
focus on the tougher things. Like I could always focus on the
Mhm.
things I enjoyed, but I remember just going, I didn't know that it could be like this. It's like someone
Mhm.
getting glasses for the first time who could never
Mhm.
see, right? And so, but then, so this has been years I've figured this out, whatever. So same as you, and then seeing the experience with my clients and things like that. I was recently talking to my dog trainer before I moved back to Colorado, and I said something, and I was talking about my dog and if they should go on medication based on things, and this is years of training I've put in, all the work, same thing, and his thoughts on medication with dogs, and whatever, an anti, and then I said, well, here's what it did for me as a person, and and after he looked at me and he goes, "Are you like embarrassed that you're on medication?" And this is like a month ago, and I was like, why do you say that? He's like, the way that you talk about it. And I said, I do this
Mhm.
for a living and I still have a stigma. Like, are you
Mhm.
kidding me? Right. And especially the people I work with are very like health focused. And I've just shifted my thing to, yeah, we don't go straight to medication. But I'll say to people, I can't diagnose you. That's not what I do. But I can
Mhm.
see enough consistency that this is affecting your day-to-day functioning that I would suggest you go to a primary care physician and just inquire about it. And that's where I
Mhm.
leave it. I say, that is up to
Mhm.
you. But if you
Mhm.
want my thoughts, my perspective, and my story, and
Mhm.
that's what I'll do. So, where does that, I mean, I know where the stigma comes from, but like, why do you think there's still a stigma? How do you deal with the stigma when people bring that up, et cetera?
I think my style is just transparency, authenticity, and integrity. And so, like you've said already multiple times, sometimes as therapists, we're trained to just be these like blank canvases with no personalities who never share anything. And I just know from doing this for many years, sometimes my story and my experience is just very helpful. And if I can share something that's going to save you a lot of time and energy and potential pain, I will happily share it. So I just am forthcoming with my clients. I'm on medication, right? I'm forthcoming on like, and here's how I take it. I take my medication most days, but not all days. Here are like different things that I've tried. I think, and this is very Brené Brown. Brené Brown
Love her.
says, shame grows like a nasty petri dish that we like put in a closet. We put that shame in a petri dish in the closet where light doesn't shine and it just grows like a mold. And the way that we basically kill shame is we take it out of the closet, we bring it into the light. When we shine light on it, the shame dies down. And so we have to just be more willing, I think, to talk about it. Same thing. So I do, I've shared, I have not the most traumatic upbringing, but definitely like not a great one. So I also am trained in EMDR, which is eye movement
Mhm.
desensitization and reprocessing, which is traditionally a trauma therapy, but you can use it to basically reprocess your response to any stress. So sometimes I'll share with my clients, here's my experience with my own EMDR, because I believe if I'm going to be a good practitioner of EMDR, I better go put myself into EMDR so I also know what the client experience is like.
Oh,
So just
yes.
sharing.
I want to comment on that quickly, and then I have another thought. One, oh, that's great. EMDR, like, it's blowing up everywhere and it's so great to see. And again, you think about from a kinesthetic, it's probably helpful for ADHD people because there's a kinesthetic component, because it
Mhm.
is eye movement, right? And the just the idea of the actually I had two thoughts, but one that in grad school, some counseling grad programs require you to be in therapy because they say like you if you're gonna have somebody in the chair, you have to be in the chair. Whether you and again, whether you've been through something or not, because turns out therapy can be for anyone. And mine didn't require that. And I remember having a conversation with a peer at one point, and he said something, and I said, "Have you ever been in the therapeutic chair?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Then can you really know what it feels like to be asked that question?" And like, how can you know what it feels like to be on the other side, disclosing your whole life to theoretically a stranger at first? And so I firmly believe that not you have to try every single little tactic that you do, but sure, I try everything and I speak from experience and I say not every tactic is going to work for everyone, but you should be in the chair. And then the second, so I love that you kind of said that. But secondly, I want to see what your thoughts are on this. I dove into the research. I like to I can read peer-reviewed journal articles. I like to dive in and see what they say. And a lot of the initial research on ADHD medication has been done primarily on men.
Mm-hmm.
And I found some studies that talked about how the need for it might be different during your cycle, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
hormones change, things like that. Talked to my prescriber about it and my therapist about it. And, I won't disclose their names so that they don't feel like they're being told, they're being unethical. But because of my level of self-control and my discipline and things like that, and they said, so there will be days in my cycle I don't take it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then I will have days where I take more than is prescribed.
Mm-hmm.
But we've discussed that with my therapist on what that looks like in my prescribers. So I'm not saying go and do that, but I've found it works.
Mm-hmm.
And so, have you noticed that? Do you see that? Or is there more research being done on women? Where's that at?
Yeah, I can say I'm definitely seeing a lot of stuff come out in the ADHD community about women in perimenopause and menopause, because that's a time where there's big hormonal fluctuations and the need to consider that when we're medicating people. Absolutely have seen articles coming through my inbox on exactly what you're talking about, more just like monthly hormonal fluctuations. I know it's something I've spoken with my own provider, where sort of that I generally take my medication 4 days a week, and then I take the weekends off plus Mondays, because Mondays are more my admin day slash catch up with life stuff
Hmm.
day. Part be a functional adult who has to grocery shop and clean my house and follow up with my own appointments that need scheduling. And part I might do some paperwork and stuff too. So for a long time, I decided not to take my meds that day because it's not a super cognitively demanding day. However, I know in like my PMS week or my period week, I have a lot more trouble just getting motivated in general. So my provider was like, just take your meds on your, like, don't take Mondays off during those 2 weeks of your cycle where your brain is just functioning differently than it is the other 2 weeks. And so now that's something I'm mindful of. Like, oh, okay, I normally don't take my meds this day, but today I will because hormonally things are different.
And it's changing your body. So if your body
Hmm.
chemistry is changing from its own existence,
Hmm.
then of course,
Hmm.
like this assistance may help. Like, I love that. So let's kind of dive into, as we wrap up here, although you and I think could talk for hours, sort
Hmm.
of some takeaways. Like, what are some things that you tend to give as either assignments or homework? Like, what are some quick wins? We obviously know that you got to get to the root of it and all that, but, what are
Hmm.
some common things you give people for tips, strategies, etc.?
Yeah, let me see if I'm gonna on the fly think of what are big three. I spoke earlier. There is often an ADHD trauma overlap. It's not definitive, but if you have ADHD, statistically, you're 4 to 6 times more likely to have some form of trauma. Trauma and ADHD also manifest in the brain very similarly. So I
Mm.
would say if you're a person who's hearing this and you think you have ADHD, but you also think maybe you have trauma, I would definitely consider reaching out and doing some trauma work, whether it's with EMDR, which is something I do, but there are other forms as well. Because then it's like you're taking one variable that's impacting your ability to perform the way you would like, and you're addressing it. And with really good trauma work, we can't make promises, but I have clients where I do trauma work and they find relief. I want to say the first appointment, but some of these people are people I've been meeting with, and then they're just finally ready to tackle their trauma. But there is the potential with EMDR, because it is somatic based therapy, that you can find relief from your trauma and help your brain function differently pretty quickly. So if you can do that, why not? Because
Mhm.
since I work with a lot of people who are high performing, high functioning, we tend to want to fix things that need fixing and get results as soon as possible because we're living lives and running businesses and leading teams, right? We don't have time to like pussyfoot around.
Sit in our feelings is what they'll come to me like. I'm like, that's great. You
Yeah,
got to sometimes
yeah,
learn to sit, but like, then what? That's what they'll come to me. They're like, I'm like, has your therapist done anything beyond sitting in your feelings? They're like, no. I'm like, well, then what do you do after you sit in the feelings? Like, what's next?
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a space for that, right? But if you can heal trauma, heal trauma. I would say you can reach out to me. If I'm not licensed in your state, you can still reach out to me and I can give you some pointers or whatever. I will be licensed to practice in most states by the end of this year. So even if
Great.
you're teeter-tottering and you're in a state I can't practice in yet, you can always reach out because I might be able to practice there very soon.
By the time you're
Um,
ready.
by the time you're ready, by the time this episode comes out, I'm supposed to be able to practice. They said late summer, early fall. We're officially in early fall. We're just waiting for the computer systems basically to be finalized so that people can track their licenses across states. But
Yep.
all the legal stuff has happened already. So we're approved to practice. We just don't have the infrastructure ready
Okay.
quite yet, but it's very close. It's called the counseling compact, if anyone wants to look into that. But I would say address trauma if you think you have trauma, because there's the potential with a good trauma therapist, you can have great impacts pretty quickly.
Hmm.
Um, the other thing I will say is the medication talk. Don't be afraid of medication. I know it can be scary. My recommendation is honestly, especially if it's ADHD, there is some stigma around stimulant medication. Get a psychiatrist. My experience has been primary care doctors do not have the comfort levels around ADHD or the understanding because their job is to know a little bit about a lot of things.
Yep.
And when we're working in your brain, I really encourage people to see a specialist. A psychiatrist is really good, especially with the things we're talking about women and hormonal fluctuations throughout the month. A psychiatrist is just much more likely to understand the brain fluctuations because
Hmm.
that's all they do all day, every day.
Yep. And those sometimes
Um,
have a long, like,
wait list.
wait list. Thank you. And then, but out of practice, sometimes private practices don't, if you're willing to do that, which obviously is great. And then, secondarily, your state may require that. So some states require that a PCP can prescribe stimulants, but in some states, like I was living in Pennsylvania, and they can't, and so you need to see a psychiatrist. So I actually
And so
commend
if you
those
can
states.
find a psychiatrist, you can skip a step. Like,
Yeah,
why would go to your PCP to just get a referral
exactly,
anyways?
exactly. So
Just go
go to
straight to a
your
psychiatrist.
yes, yes, I
Totally.
agree.
And then I would say, if I'd say like the big three things I would want you to know, okay, I'm gonna actually give you four.
Okay.
I will say mindfulness practice if you want something that you can do on your own and you want a holistic method. The, Google ADHD and mindfulness, look around the ADHD communities. When we're talking about holistic strategies, you will see mindfulness mentioned over and over and over again. That is something you can consistently make a habit in your life. A lot of my undergraduate research, because I was a yoga teacher before I was a
Hmm.
therapist, was actually on mindfulness and yoga and its impact on the brain. Um, and what I share with my own clients is I was in grad school a while ago, so this data might be different now. But there's some really strong data that people who practice daily mindfulness, after about 12 weeks, we can put you in an fMRI machine, which is where we measure basically the electrical activity and what's going on in your brain. And after about 12 weeks, you will show decreased activation in the emotional parts of your brain. So you basically become less reactive. That's pretty fast. 12 weeks is not terrible. That's about 3 months of practice. When they do the same thing for people who have a mindfulness practice for longer than that, people who are more lifetime mindfulness practitioners or long-term mindfulness practitioners, what they see is basically increased connection between the emotional part of your brain, which is your limbic system, and the rational part of your brain, which is your cortex. And basically, how I interpret that is a lot of people, we talk about having that feeling of the angel and the devil on your shoulder, like your brain is pulling you in two different directions. And one is the voice of what you should be doing, and one is the voice of what you want to or don't want to be doing, rational
Yeah.
and emotional. When we have mindfulness consistently, we're literally increasing connections in the two brain regions that regulate those voices. So they actually get better at mediating and talking with each other and working together instead of against each other. And when we talk specifically ADHD, that's a place where our brains are genuinely lacking a little bit. We show decreased connection between our emotional center and our prefrontal cortex. So we're already starting with a bit of a deficit in that area. And so doing
Mm.
that practice helps, I think, compensate for that. So I would say mindfulness. And then I would say, honestly, I said, I believe earlier, I don't believe ADHD is actually a disability, although it's diagnosable in the DSM-5. If you want to use that diagnosis to
Yep.
access health benefits, you can get a diagnosis and do that. Um, I I think my ADHD personally has I wouldn't be as successful as I am at such a young age if I weren't for my ADHD. With that said, depending on the data you crunch, I was looking at the DSM, which this one was published probably 2010, maybe. It's pretty old at this point. And
DSM-5,
they
yeah, it's probably 2012, I think, or something. Yeah.
2012,
Because we
I
were on
can
the five
literally,
when I was in grad school. So it would have been,
right?
yeah.
The
So maybe
mobile app,
2012,
it says, yeah,
maybe
this
2010.
says I'm going to tell you. I can just look, right? 2013.
Ah, yeah.
2013. So, it's about 12 years old. According to DSM, 2.5% of adults have ADHD. Now they're saying it's closer to about 6% because this is dated.
Yeah.
With that said, that means most people do not have ADHD. And if you're a neurodivergent person existing in a neurotypical world, there's a lot of extra cognitive demand that places on you. There's a lot of extra stress that places on you because basically 95% of people that you engage with, 90% of how the world is set up is not necessarily aimed at your functioning in your brain. So I think it's really important for people with ADHD to have a therapist or a coach that can help you basically manage consistently because I don't think that's going away.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so if maybe 2.5 to 6% of us have ADHD and we're trying to deal with that on our own, that's a tall order, I think, that you are putting upon yourself, that you are welcome to put upon yourself. But
Yeah.
maybe it would be easier if you had some support and guidance from people like us who understand not just from an empathic place, but we also understand the psychology and the
Yeah.
brain science that can help you
Yeah.
leverage your neurological differences instead of sometimes feeling uh, handicapped by them.
Yeah, I love that. It's true with a lot of things, right? Everything that's our greatest strength can sometimes be our greatest weakness, and some
Mhm.
things that are our greatest weakness can also be our greatest strength, right? And so I love that you kind of tied all that together. Let me ask you, we didn't really discuss this a ton, but when it comes to those are all great tips, also stuff I've used and worked for me. So I love that. And I often, especially those people, you probably have this too with your clients and even yourself. Like when you talk about mindfulness or meditation, and they're like, they literally are like, how do I do this better? Like, how do I do this? Like, that's what they're thinking about, right? Or I've given people, your job is 2 minutes of meditation over the next
Mhm.
week. Like, it's not,
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be 30 minutes, it doesn't have to be like that. And people laughed at me and then they do it. And then I get a message in the morning. I just meditated for 10 minutes.
Mhm.
Awesome. Like it's like anything, it's a muscle you have to build. So if you're the
Mhm.
person that sits down for the first 30 seconds and you're like, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that, like that's part of the practice. It's a practice. It's not it's a skill to be learned. It's not like you sit down and you just figure it out. So, like you said, that 12 weeks, I love that because it's like anything, like you wouldn't expect someone to learn, a certain workout or a lift, a snatch or whatever in a day. So why would you expect to master meditation in a day?
Yeah, and I
So I
often
love
tell
that.
my clients, I would be a terrible, if I were a personal trainer and you were starting from scratch and I told you to go deadlift 300 or 400 pounds or whatever, you would injure yourself and I would be very bad at my job,
Yes.
right? But maybe we start with hand weights, like you start
Yeah.
somewhere and you start small and you be consistent and trust that then you grow the muscle. But we're talking about mental muscle here, right? We're
Yep.
talking about growing mental muscle. And once you start and you become consistent, you might find that you might meditate for longer, or maybe it doesn't even have to look like meditation. I know from my previous work in the yoga community, and studying different forms of meditation. There's so many different ways to be mindful. Meditation doesn't necessarily mean you just have to sit still and stop, though that can be,
Hmm.
right? I don't want to say a million different forms of meditation, but there's a lot of variability. So it's also about finding the right type. Um,
I do a lot of the grounding
and
techniques. That one I think resonates because they like tangible things to do,
mhm.
So
Yeah, things that get you into your body. There's a lot of different ways. And once you start the habit, I think what my goal is I teach people mindfulness because I want that presence to bleed out into every aspect of your life. So it doesn't always have to feel like something you have to sit and do that feels really structured. We can also help you be mindful when you're writing an email
Mhm.
or, when you're making your coffee in the morning. You can also find ways to weave it into your life that don't have to feel super formal. Because I also think some of us with ADHD, we're such a conundrum where a lot of us who are high functioning, we get that OCD kind of thing where we get super organized and super structured, but also try and fucking tell me I have to do something at any time. And I will be like, I'm not doing that.
Yep. Yep. So that does tie into, the piece that I really want to like kind of end on, I guess, is entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
Does entrepreneurship just like attract ADHD type people because of exactly that? They like can't be told what to do. They like to
Mhm.
have their hands in a million hats and be
Mhm.
high level on everything, not super in the weeds on everything.
Mhm.
It's almost like a which came first, the chicken or the egg, but is that a
Mhm.
common theme you see?
Yeah, I mean, the data is definitely there. Like I shared, depending on where you look, they say 3 to 6% of adults have ADHD. Um, they say about 30% of entrepreneurs have ADHD. So you're more than
Mm.
3 times likely to have ADHD if you're an entrepreneur. And I think one thing I've learned anecdotally, ADHD people tend to be very high integrity people. And what I mean by that is we need to believe in the work that we're doing, or we need to at least see the purpose of it. Like if someone said, just hit that button and I'm going to give you $100, we have a hard time doing something just because someone says we should do it. We need to
Yep.
understand the bigger picture.
Yes.
And so I think that's why many of us are drawn to entrepreneurship. And I think many of us have that 30,000 feet sort of skill that I talked about earlier, where because I guess to bring it full circle, we talked about ADHD being an attention deficit disorder, but that being inaccurate. The problem with ADHD brains, if we want to even call it a problem, is we can't focus because we can actually take in more sensory information than average people. So other people might be having a couple of thoughts, we're having 25 or 30, and we're taking in information from the world around us about all the things that are happening. And that's why I think we make really good executives and business owners, because we just see things other people don't see,
Yes.
because we are able to actually take in so much information and actually literally absorb more input than neurotypical
Yeah, and I
people.
think that's what makes a lot of people so obsessed with like organization. I
Mm-hmm.
go, the reason that it's about being organized for me is that my brain will take in all that clutter and it will
Mm-hmm.
distract me from the things I should be taking in. So when I have
Mm-hmm.
organization, it's the cognitive load. I also think
Mm-hmm.
it's what makes me really good with people because what I've trained it to do is pick up the slightest little nuances, right? It's like we can kind of
Mm-hmm.
train that. And it's like people will say things and it's just the way that they phrased it differently that I'm like, there's more to it than that somebody else might not
Mm-hmm.
notice. And so whatever
Mm-hmm.
you do really well because
Mm-hmm.
you can take in all that extra stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So business ownership, et cetera, and the whys and the, I've been a great employee some places and I've been a terrible employee because they tell me to do something and I'm like, I don't see the purpose and I'm not trying to be defiant. It's just, I don't have time to waste, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're exactly right on the like needing to have purpose and mission and then last thing I guess I mean there's and then I'll ask you if there's anything else you want to add, but one thing that I think is helpful to think about is basically what you're saying is a third of the people that are entrepreneurs are probably ADHD, but everybody probably experiences some ADHD symptoms. And like I
Mm-hmm.
say, like everything, you can experience symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, because these are things that are designed to help us, right? Anxiety is a survival mechanism originally. We just have chronic
Mm-hmm.
anxiety now, which is problematic and interferes with day-to-day functioning. So will these same things that you gave for tips work for someone who just has the symptoms of ADHD because of society and the world around them and the systems, maybe besides the medication, as the people that are truly ADHD combined with the vulnerability of ADHD and the systems that they're part of? Would those same strategies work either way?
Yeah, because I would say, A, if you have trauma, whether you have ADHD or not, trauma puts your brain into chronic stress mode, even if you don't realize it. And chronic stress, fight or flight mode is sneaky. A lot of high functioning people don't even realize they're in fight or flight mode because their fight or flight mode has been channeled into being productive.
Hmm.
But just because you're being productive doesn't mean you're being effective. And
Yep.
so targeting your trauma will help you be more effective and intentional. Um, then when it comes to mindfulness, I personally just think mindfulness is helpful for all of us. And a coach is going to give you accountability where you can see the patterns, right? And figure out, because I think sometimes if we talk about systemic issues, then you'll probably would agree, depending on the client, it might mean, hey, you need to exit this system. Potentially, it's a toxic workplace and there's not a lot that can be done. Or maybe there is, but you just, in your wise mind, know you don't want to put that energy into it. You'd rather put it into your family or other priorities you care about. Sometimes you need to exit a toxic system. Sometimes you need to push back against a toxic system and change it and be the enactor of change. Sometimes you are your own toxic system that you don't even realize, where you've internalized behaviors. I know I have been there, where it's more internal work that needs to be done. And I think we're here to help you figure out, when do you just need to leave something behind? When do you need to push back on it? When do you have to do more internal work? And a lot of times you might need to do kind of all of those things, depending on the
That's
situation and the circumstance.
so well said. So well said.
Mhm.
Is there anything else, Nikolai, that you think is important that we didn't talk about?
Anything else important? Well, I will say, right, we asked the question, how do you tell if it's ADHD or modern society? Attention spans are just not good in 2025. And so a lot of us are feeling ADHD like. And I remember when I was at Salem State, which is the undergrad that you and I both went to,
Mhm.
back in the early 2000s, they were already talking about how the internet has decreased our attention spans and our ability to focus. There was a really good book, if anyone listening is interested on just focus in general and how it's shifted. It is called Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. Really good data there. For example, Basically, we now switch tasks. They studied college students every 65 seconds,
Wild.
which is crazy. Um, the median amount of time that an average college student can focus is 19 seconds.
Wow.
Adult office workers, on average, um, are only able to spend 3 minutes on a task before we get distracted.
Wow.
3 minutes. But every time we get distracted, it takes 23 minutes to refocus.
Mm-hmm.
And the average CEO, this one really stuck with me because we worked with a lot of high functioning, successful people. The average CEO only actually gets 28 minutes of uninterrupted time in a day.
Yeah.
So think about that. You have an 8 hour day. You only have a half hour of uninterrupted time. Every time you're interrupted, it takes you 20 minutes to reconnect with what you're working on. For me, that says there's a lot of wasted mental effort that's
Yeah.
happening in the world right now. And that's not an
Refocusing. Yeah.
ADHD thing, that's a social thing.
Yeah, I say that a lot with the project. I'm like, you guys, that's not a task, that's a project. So that's why every time you sit down to look at your task list, you spend 25 minutes figuring out where to start and then you lost the time to start. So you do this every time you look at this project, which is a task item on your list. And so you need
Mhm.
to, the first time you look at it, set up your next steps and then break that
Mhm.
down. And even still like to your point on the CEO, now in certain corporate environments, it's not necessarily possible, but if you have the control, I do a lot of I want to say mindset shifting on boundaries because we know it's overused and all that, but that like you setting boundaries around who can interrupt you and when is actually helping them because you're getting more stuff done and being more productive and being a better leader or boss. So instead of thinking about it like you're not allowing access to you, make it so that you're allowing better access to you when it's allowed. And
Mhm.
that has changed a lot of their views on, you're right, it is actually to help other people that I do this and that
Mhm.
kind of stuff, like to what you just said about that 28 minutes. Who like so then by that point they're just taking a break, like
Well,
they,
what can you get done in 28 minutes when you really think about it?
exactly nothing. I'm
Mhm.
like, I can go mark 3 emails as unread and remind
Mhm.
myself to reply to them the next time I have a block.
Mhm.
That's what it is. So this has been great. I admire you. I love you, Nikolai. I think you're amazing. Where can people find you?
Best place is my website. It's ompowermentpsych.com. So OM, like we're meditating, Ompowerment, POWERMENT, psych, like psychology, PSYCH.com is the best way. And then if you're on LinkedIn, you're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn as well, hearkening to the conversations we're having about modern society and technology and demands and boundaries. I am on no other forms of social media. I am not on Instagram. I'm not on Facebook. You can Google me, you will find me because I technically have those accounts, but I have not used them for years. So if you find me there, you will forever live in Nikolai social media purgatory. And it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's because I pick and choose where my time and attention goes. But LinkedIn
Oh
I
my
am on if
gosh.
you want to
Did
find
I
me
just hear
there.
you say that you practice what you preach? I love to hear that. Oh, wow.
I try, I try.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. I think there's a ton of good stuff in here. We'll link all those things that she mentioned too. Maybe not the Instagram because you'll live in Instagram purgatory, but
Mhm.
thank you so much. I think this is going to benefit so many people and just open the gates of, scratch the surface of what they could learn about and hopefully can connect with
Mhm.
you further to learn even more about their own personal selves in regards to this stuff.
I love it. Thank you.
Thanks.